So this is the sheet that we're trying to fill out and get some answers to, and we'll walk through what deck scoring is in a second. If you look at the epics here, they should encompass all the work that we're trying to get done by the end of the year. And we'll walk through how those are set up. So why don't I just walk through what deck scoring is and what we're trying to do. So what I've done here is I've outlined each of the epics and then each of the issues that we have for each particular epic. And then what we're trying to do is figure out, are these small, medium, or large? These are really t-shirt size. The goal is not to get caught up on, is this, a day or 2 days? We're really trying to say, is this something that's pretty straightforward? Is it something that's in the middle? Or it's like, hey, this is a really big thing that has to get broken down. And there is a tab here for deck scoring that kind of explains it a little bit more. And basically what we're going to do is once we have a small, medium, or large for whether it's defined, what the effort is, and what the complexity is, it will give us a weight. And these weights are just a number that allow us to start saying, okay, this item is really big. It's a 34 versus this other item is a 1. And that will help us prioritize. It will help us figure out some resourcing. Again, these are large kind of large blocks of effort. They're not trying to figure out like, hey, day to day or week to week. In terms of defined is probably the most confusing one, because a small means it's well defined and it's very articulate in terms of what it needs to do. A medium, there's still some open questions, and a large means that there's a lot of gaps in our understanding of what that is. Effort and complexity, these are a little bit more intuitive: a small effort, medium effort, and a large effort. Here we just use an analogy of a wheelbarrow is a wheelbarrow load of rocks, a moving truck load of rocks, or a dump truck. And that's the same way we want to think about the engineering. Like, hey, is this a little config change? Is this, hey, we're gonna have to change a couple parts of the application, or hey, this is gonna require big architectural type things. And then complexity is similar to effort, but complexity and effort can be, often they're gonna travel together, but there's some cases where they're not. And depending on the issue, we'll get into that. For example, one of the examples here they have is CVEs. It's a huge amount of work just to get them all in there, but the complexity is very low. So with that in mind, any questions before we kind of jump into the epics? Cool. So let me walk you through on this screen here the epics, because this is a little bit, I think, easier since I've flattened it out a little bit. We have, I don't know what this is, probably 7 or 8 different epics. And all of these epics are to get us to complete. There's an epic to go from complete to lovable, but we're not going to focus on that because that is going to be next year. So within viable to complete, so if you click on viable to complete here, you will find all the sub epics. And this is what we're showing in the Google Sheet. So I just copied these over into the sheet, and you can see the total number of issues under each particular one. And that's what we've got in this sheet here. So we've got on-demand scans, and then I'll hand this over probably to Derek in a couple minutes, and he can start walking us through these issues. And then the idea on each of these issues, my guess is we'll probably only get through maybe half of these, because we want to definitely answer questions, discuss what these are, and try to figure out like, hey, is everyone on the same page as to what these are? If not, that's okay too. And that tells us that, maybe these aren't well defined and we need to spend more time on that. So we've got on-demand scans, which is this idea of a web page where you can run a scan, and you've got some GUI interface to do that. Easier configuration of DAST. This is a lot of the work that we're doing now in 13 and 13.1, 13.2, just the environment variables, better YAML files, things of that sort. Configuration improvements, builds on that. Better ways to work with DAST vulnerabilities. Things like record and replay, adding timestamps, DAST vulnerabilities on the dashboard. We've got DAST error handling and messaging. So just providing the user better feedback to help them configure it. False positive reduction effort, deduplication, and then DAST specific reports page. So with that, maybe we can jump into kind of the on-demand scans, and maybe we start working through this first issue, if that works for everyone. Cool. So Derek, do you want to walk us through kind of what you had in mind for these, and then we can kind of start the conversation from there?
Sure. So the first two, Seth and I have been talking about this idea of configuration and how it makes sense in DAST. And the way that Zap does configuration is very similar to the way that other DAST tools do it, in that they split up this idea of what is your website and what is your scan configurations, and you can apply many to many basically relationship between them. So the scan profile is basically just taking the stuff around what does the scan do when it's running, and some of these are the new ones that we're adding in the next few releases. Some of them have been there for a while, but basically it's taking this idea of a configuration profile that you can have multiple of them within one project rather than a single configuration for DAST in a project, and then switch between them for whatever scans you want. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have a ton to say about it. We don't have UI or UX designs for it yet, unfortunately. A lot of these are going to be that way, so I know that there's going to be a lot of ambiguity around exactly what needs to be done. So I'm hoping that we can get enough clarity on them. But yeah, the profiles are just that. It's self-contained profiles that users can swap out as they run their tests.
And Derek, there are some designs in one of these issues that maybe we can back up and walk through those designs a little bit, which might put some of these pieces in place a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah.
Do you remember which issue that is?
Yeah, it was in the post MVC, the very first one. Yeah. The very last, depending on which way you're looking at it. The earliest one.
Okay.
And she, yeah, in the Figma, yeah.
Okay, cool. So this is still very early draft, and I think there's been a lot of thinking that's occurred since this has been built.
Mm-hmm.
But basically the idea, and I was talking, I think, to Craig about this today, when you think about what a scan is, I think of it mentally as three different things. So you've got your site, which is in Zap terms, it's the context, and your site is, your URL. It's the paths that you want to scan or not scan. It's going to be your authentication. So potentially some headers that you might want to send in, your username, password. That information is a site or a context. And we want to build out some kind of model for that and some way to manage a list of sites and all those settings. The next item that you have is scan settings. And so those are things like, do you want to update the add-ons here? What rules do you want to run? What are specific things that you want to tell the engine to do? And those scan settings are independent, potentially independent of the actual site. So for example, you could have a quick scan, you could have a lengthy scan, you could have an active scan, passive scan, and then, maybe a passive scan that runs for 60 minutes, maybe a passive scan that runs for, 10 minutes. So you have scan settings. And then the third, which I don't know if we have any issues open for, is schedules. So you can run the combination of those two items at a particular schedule. So maybe you're running it against site one, quick scan every week, site one, lengthy scan every month. So we want to build out those object models and then interfaces to support all of that. That cuts across a bunch of the issues, actually. but I just kind of wanted to zoom out. So that's going to be when we talk about a scan profile, a site profile. So the site settings, like I described, the scan setting. And then these others are ways of pulling out those profiles. So let me back up and show you. One of the ways of potentially saving this information. So right now, all of this information has to get stored in the GitLab CI YAML file, which has its own challenges. And so one of the ideas here is to change it so that you would have, your DAST template, same way that you've got it today. And instead of setting all your variables in your YAML file, you could have this idea of a profile. So profile 1 in this example. In this case, profile 1, so this would be in your YAML file. It would go to the analyzer, and then the analyzer would pull profile 1 out of the database. And this is all managed through a web interface. And this gives us the ability to query these across projects, across instances, across groups. So you could look to see if everyone has a particular profile. And then your template to get this going is much simpler. The other option is to do the same architecture, except you just say profile1.yaml and it gets persisted to a YAML file. The difference between these is the process in which we can persist this data. So if we persist it directly to a database, we can just save it to a database, no big deal, right? Just a standard web form. If you do it to a YAML file, which is then persisted in the repo, you then have questions about, do you do a merge request and things of that sort. So the workflow is not necessarily as streamlined if you put it into the repo. And then there's also potentially just doing fallback. So, if you said profile 1, we look in the database first. If we don't find it in the database, we look for a YAML file and do something like that. So all of this is really built around making this much, much easier. And so the goal is that you would be able to come in here, click on on-demand scans, plug in your URL, select your scan settings or configure, a scan profile, select the scan profile and hit go, and then start getting results back. So it pulls a lot of this work out of the pipeline, and it means you can run this independent of your pipelines. Any questions on kind of that big vision, or from there we can kind of jump into what these issues are individually?
And maybe it's into the weeds a little bit, but one thing that kind of dawned on me when I was looking at that was how is there any thought into how we prevent people from scanning sites that they don't own?
Yeah, so we do have currently domain validation. It's optional right now, even for the full scan. But one of the things that I've talked to David, my boss, about, and that I'm planning on doing, I haven't written it up yet, is to make that domain validation mandatory for an active scan, because you're actively trying to attack a website with that. So there's multiple ways that we can do it. Right now, we look for a text file, I believe. But you can also do it with headers. You could do some sort of DNS thing. So there's multiple ways that we could do it. But yeah, I'm planning on making that domain validation mandatory for the attack or the active scans.
Okay, cheers.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the kind of stuff we want to figure out, or at least raise those questions here, because without getting into solutions, that is a big question. Like if your scan profile has an active scan, we then need to have some kind of validation against that. So I put that here under the asynchronous scans MVC, but this piece of work will need to get defined in one of these issues.
Right, and I'm taking notes about what I need to add or create for these. So I guess I could just do it in the Google Doc.
Yeah, and I think we can, Derek, maybe after this meeting, we can go and put these notes in each respective issue where they make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you can do it in real time.
Yeah, I was just going to use that Google Doc for the discussion guide or the agenda that you sent out.
Okay, perfect. So any preference on which order we go through these? We can start at the top and start going through and answer questions.
Is there a particular order in which you would play the issues?
Partially, to me, that depends on the implementation, how technically, because I've got this vision of what I want to do. You guys are going to have to tell me, or you all are going to have to tell me what needs to happen in order to get them done in order. So the most important thing is the on-demand scans and the configuration, the ease of use. The rest of them sort of have come out of different conversations, but those two are the big important ones that we absolutely need to get done. So, I mean, it's really, I'm going to be dependent on your feedback to decide how to put these in. I started with the configuration stuff because it's starting out with just adding environment variables. So that's pretty easy and a good way to get started. But the rest of them, I really don't know.
Fair enough. I guess it's hard for me to think about implementation because there's so much about this that I don't understand. For example, like what's the permission model going to be? Who can change this screen? When they click to start an on-demand scan, where do they see the job log and how do they download artifacts? Where with the vulnerabilities, how do the vulnerabilities map into the security dashboard? Is that where they see them? And is that different to what happens on a normal scan? So there's a lot of, at least from the way I understand it, there's a lot of things I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. Derek, are you getting some of these into the document here?
Yeah, I am. But we will have to go through them one at a time.
Yeah, so if everyone opens up this document that's attached to the agenda and we can just put in some of these questions so we don't lose track of them.
I mean, I kind of feel like on issues this big, when I say big, I mean, it's a lot of work. And sorry, I'll just shut the window. I don't think that made any difference, but like issues this big, I feel like we need a discovery to actually understand some of the questions that we need to answer before we can like put any kind of estimate on something that has at least a somewhat likely probability of not changing.
Right. Yeah, I think there will be some research spikes that we have to put in here. Again, right now we have big, broad brushstrokes. So I think today, like the questions you asked, those are good. We want to start getting those in here, and then we can start putting together issues to answer each of those.
Okay.
Yeah, and some of them are going to be, I'm going to need you to help answer them. For example, the issues, the vulnerabilities when they're found and putting them on the dashboard. To me, just from a user perspective, I don't see any issue with putting them on the dashboard and saying, hey, here's more vulnerabilities. But from a technical perspective, I don't know if that's feasible. So that's some of those questions are things that I haven't answered because I need engineering input on them.
Yeah. Yeah. And to be honest, I mean, I feel like I need to get a pen and paper and write some of this stuff down and work it out and understand what it would be like for a user who creates an MR when scan profile is different. Like, are they going to see like that they've fixed vulnerabilities when they actually haven't versus introduced new vulnerabilities when they actually haven't, just because the scan profile's changed? that kind of stuff.
Okay, that makes sense.
But maybe that's just a new issue we need to create, which is like do something on the MR widget which makes sense to a user.
I have a sort of answer to where do vulnerabilities show up. I don't know if this is the time and place to give my answer or not. Like, how deep are we going into discussing these questions right now?
Yeah, I mean, go for it. We can kind of zoom back out if we get too deep.
Okay, so for now, they will all just get dumped onto the dashboards with everything else. And then if we jump back, I'm not sure who's screen sharing right now. If we jump back to the spreadsheet, we're going to address the fact that it's difficult to work with them all on the dashboard in the Epic DAST, better ways to work with DAST vulnerabilities on line 31. And I think that there's going to have to be a lot of thinking and then probably rethinking of how to deal with all these vulnerabilities and the different profiles. I have not thought about any of that. I also have a question to add around the profiles. How is a new profile created and saved? In the mockup that we saw, you can add details for a new profile, but then it just says run scan. There's no like separate save profile button. Is it just like if you make a new profile with a new name, it will automatically save that profile? And then it'll appear in the dropdown to choose from later?
Yeah, that's something that Camellia is actively working on. It's probably going to move. You might be able to create a new profile in line there, but I think it makes more sense to have those profiles be created in the configuration area right now, where we just show whether something is a scanner's turned on or off. I think that it makes more sense to have a DAST configuration area there. So she is actively iterating on those to change things around. I don't think she quite understood the idea of the profiles the first time, so we're working on that.
Let me walk you through, Cam had the question of like which item we were gonna do first. I don't think there's a design for this right now, but I think it's this one, right? The MVC.
Yeah.
So literally for the MVC, maybe I do we would have our side nav, on the left, it would just say on-demand scans, and it would just say site to scan. And it would be an input box. And then go, or whatever. So this would be our first MVC, and then what we would do is start building from there. And the idea here is this is no different than if you install the passive scan today, right? You just include the template and you put in a URL and it runs a scan. So that would be our MVC, and that's where we would start. And the benefit to this is, my understanding is if we did this, this would run on a runner. We can fire off the job. It would run on a runner. It would run against the site. The one thing that we would have to do is associate it with a branch. And then that branch is where the results would get attached to. So if we attach it to the master branch or the default branch, it would show up in the dashboard. If we attach it to another branch, so long as there's an MR, it would get attached to the pipeline view on that MR. So this would be our MVC right here. And then building from the MVC, that's when we would start introducing this idea of setting up a site, which would be the site, the URLs to exclude. There's an issue open for the technologies. Let me see. Derek, you don't know which one that is, do you? The one for the technologies, the screenshot. But we would have the configuration for the site, which would include like, hey, what technology is your website running? That's one of the things that we want to do with Wappalizer.
It's the second to the last in that scan configuration improvements.
This one?
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, you got the third one.
So we would, when you set up your website, and this is, again, if you go back to Zap, it's all about the Zap context. You'd select what technologies and you'd set up all your site settings. So that would be kind of potentially the second part of the first iteration after the MVC. Then maybe the third would be, okay, let's configure all your scan settings, which would be all the rules about how you, what rules you want to run, how long you want it to run, and any of the other advanced kind of configuration. And then the next iteration would be potentially introducing schedules. We don't need schedules initially because, it's good enough to hit go. And then we'd probably want to focus on getting, these configurations really working nicely.
So I understand how you can iterate on the initial premise, which is just a target and the button go. But so you're suggesting running it on a branch and creating an MR, but you may not have a branch, right?
So if you don't have a branch, it would be the default branch,
which is master.
Right. And so then those vulnerabilities, because right now, in order to, and again, this is MVC, in order to run a job, it has to be associated with a branch.
Okay.
Because you need those results to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And this is something we'll have to do some more technical work on. Abiel and I spent a little bit of time playing around with this.
Right.
We'll have to do some more work, but if you hit go, you basically run a job and then that'll be attached to a particular branch.
But we can't create an MR from that, right? Because if you've only got one branch, you're not going to create an MR from master to master.
Yeah, and that could be a potential problem. So, it could be that we say, if you run the scan, we're going to always attach those results to master.
And that's what I actually have defined in the MVC issue.
Okay.
The other option is, I guess I don't know, can you create an MR without any code changes?
I mean, it seems like it's misusing MR, right?
Right.
It doesn't mean it's not a valid place to start, but
I mean, it could be a little quirky. You create a new branch that's just like DAST on-demand scan results. You open it up
white
in
space
MR.
to a file.
I don't know if you need to do that. It'd be an interesting thing to test out. But you could open up an MR, maybe it is a white space, and then because we now have a ref and a SHA code, we could attach these results to that, and then you'd see it in the pipeline view.
Yeah, I see the whole branch thing working, but the MR thing I don't, because even like the security scan widget on the MR, it'd be comparing master to master, which you just ran a scan for.
Well, remember that when you're scanning a website, and this is one of the challenges that we have that I think none of the other security groups do, we're scanning a URL, which isn't really related to a branch. Like when we scan a URL, we don't actually know the version or what's running at that URL. Heck, it could be running like source code from some other repository. Like on my repo, I could be scanning Google, and it's gonna be like, hey, on your new branch, you introduce this vulnerability. It's like, I don't have the source code for Google. So it's not really tied to a branch the way that the other tools are, like a SaaS tool is. And that's one of the reasons I think the on-demand scans makes a bit more sense to pull away from the MRs and to have some more of these interfaces that you can run directly. Because one of the goals too is, if you have corporate assets that are up there, a bunch of websites, you should be able to come into our tool and just scan those, run a DAST scan, even if you don't have the source code, or
Right.
even if you're not the developer, assuming that they're your assets and you control them as a IT department or whatever.
Yeah, and that's part of the thing for these is that eventually, like Seth said, DAST is in a very different area than any of the other scanners are. And one of the criteria for getting to complete is that you have to be able to compete and displace another tool. So you've got all these other DAST tools that we're supposed to compete against, and being able to run a scan on demand is one of the primary use cases. And so it's a very different thing that we have to go after than almost the rest of GitLab. There's a couple other people that are dealing with some of the same things, but and eventually this could, maybe in the lovable stage, live more in the group level, because it may be that they want to lock it down to, and this would be more for like an enterprise, want to lock it down to a couple people that can run the scans for all of the projects and not have the individual projects run the scans. So, I mean, it's a challenge for us that we're going to have to solve, and we may have to go outside of the accepted way of doing things at GitLab in terms of everything being attached to pipeline MR. We're going to have to figure that out and figure out how we can work around things.
Yeah, I get the value, and I appreciate what you both are saying. My feeling is that if we're going to be, you know, shoving square pegs in round holes, there'd be dragons.
I totally get that. Yeah.
So Cam, I'm trying to think about just how we articulate the concern here so that we can figure out how to address that. I know what you're saying. I'm trying to condense.
I can try and write something.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is if we're running scans and attaching it to pipelines or to branches, when they're really not originating there, what's going to happen? Like, is it going to behave properly?
Yeah, I mean, that's my question. But I mean, for me, I mean, I can go and write up some of my concerns and questions I have and things I don't understand, but I would just be tempted to put larges on all of your deck scores for this first issue and move on.
Right. Yep. Attaching vulnerabilities. Yeah, so what our goal here is going to be is figure out which of these defined are larges, so that the goal would be that, you know, over the next couple of weeks, we can get these defined down to mediums and smalls. We're not going to know all the answers, particularly until we get to closer to implementing these, right? We're not going to spend weeks defining all of this, you know, planning and all that kind of stuff. But we want to get probably away from some of the larges in the defined areas, so that we can start, you know, that's the work that Derek and I need to do ahead of the engineering team.
Yeah, and I guess my question around this, Cam, would be, would you put larges on the definition, or would you put larges on the effort and complexity? That's because that's really going to be a difference of whether I need to do more work in defining it more, or whether the engineering team needs to do work to figure out if it's even possible, or what we need to do to reach what the definition is.
Well, I would say I don't fully understand the deck scoring yet, but I would say I would say effort and complexity are hard to determine if you don't fully understand the landscape. But also, to me, effort and complexity seem coupled. So to me, it seems fairly complex, with a fairly high risk that complexity is even more complex than we think. But that high risk is associated with not understanding the implications.
Yeah, it's very circular, right? And I think that's part of the challenge, is to make sure we break that circle at some point and start adding some more details so we can start answering some questions. Let's go through the MVC here. So we talked about that one, which is literally this page, in terms of what needs to happen as part of that MVC. Do you feel like that gives a pretty good definition, or would you still say that that's a pretty largely undefined? Get rid of these. So we're talking the MVC here.
So as far as the page to launch things go, I feel like I have a good idea of what that is supposed to be like,
Mhm.
but I don't have a great idea of what we're supposed to do with the results, which I think is something Cam is getting at. The results can end up on the security dashboard, and they will by default when we parse the pipeline, assuming we ran it against the default branch. But there's also, do we want to show people the pipeline page? I guess they might have that by default. I'm making a lot of assumptions in my mind. I don't know if they're the same ones that y'all have. For example, I see we hit go, we redirect them to a pipeline page, which has whatever builds this has, and then they're going to have all the normal pipeline stuff. But it's going to be a bit weird mixed in with the rest of their pipelines if they want to go see the list of pipelines on /pipelines. And then this is assuming that it's on the default branch. And so I think that can work. And then if we want to do non-default branch stuff, it definitely gets stickier.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And I only have these assumptions because Seth and I talked this out back in February and did a spike on it technically. And so I feel like there's sort of an engineering back and forth on how do we do this. That's going to take some time to have. Anyway, yeah.
Right, and in the issue, some of that is defined. Camelia and I went back and forth in a little bit in the comments, and Neil chimed in as well that she's going to mock up a page that's just going to have a list of all of the on-demand scans that you've started, so that you can click on it and then it will take you to the pipeline page. Because at this point in the MVC, I want to reuse as much as possible that we already have. And so the issues will show up, or the vulnerabilities will show up in the security dashboard. The pipeline page is going to be the same. It's going to be odd, not just having that page for these on-demand scans, but it is an MVC. So the goal will be to obviously move past that at some point, but just for the MVC, yeah, we want to reuse as much as we possibly can that we already have.
So Derek, I have the question on the MVC. If we did, like, you hit the go button and you go to the pipeline page, potentially that could be a little bit disjointed from, like, how did I get to this pipeline page? I was just on an on-demand scan. How does GitLab think about that from is a weird user experience acceptable in an MVC? Or, is our definition of done not to have those kind of disjointed experiences? Like, how much of that work do we have to do as part of the initial build?
Yeah, I think it really depends. I mean, it's going to depend on the feature and the what we're doing. But that's exactly the thing that Camelia brought up, and why she wanted to have an in-between page where you start a scan, it takes you to this page where you can see the scan listed, because you could theoretically start multiple on-demand scans at once, rather than just flipping you over to the pipeline page. That way, when you click on that, then it takes you over to the pipeline page. So there's some issues to work out what's actually on that in-between page, and that's where she's supposed to be mocking it up. I pinged her today to see if she had anything, but I haven't heard back, because I think it was too late for her in Europe whenever I pinged her.
Yeah, I mean, because the issue that I have thinking about MVC is, we can't sacrifice. The whole point of an MVC is we don't sacrifice quality, we sacrifice scope.
Right.
So we cut the scope as much as possible. So if you have kind of this disjointed experience, is that a scope issue or is that a quality issue? And I don't know how our UX team thinks about that, or how the product team thinks about that. It's obviously not a black and white answer. But I think that's where trying to figure out exactly how much of that is scope versus quality changes the size of this MVC quite a bit. Because if we were to build this and say, okay, you have a go button, and then we're just going to, flip you over to the pipelines page, right? That's literally just a redirect. That's much less development than, okay, we're going to now open up potentially a new database table, have a list of these, you'll have a refresh, have a bunch of different statuses. That's a bit more work. And so I think that's that's why I wouldn't give this a small in terms of a defined. I'd want to go more towards a medium. My inclination is we do have some definition around what we're trying to look for, so it wouldn't be completely undefined.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me, because there is still some definition depending on what she comes up with for that intermediate page. Because this is we're basically trying to build a whole new product that is a standalone product for most companies, and we're trying to get these definitions done extremely quickly so that we can start engineering work. And so I apologize, but a lot of it is going to be on the fly, and it's going to be coming in stages, because this is stuff that, ideally I would have had 8 to 10 months to sit here and define the entire workflow and the product and all that, but I don't. And so we've got to run while we're trying to figure out where we're going.
Yep. Okay, so on this, we kind of talked about the questions. Is there anything else in terms of complexity or effort that people wanted to have questions about?
You can define more than one pipeline for a single project, right? Like, is it easy to create a new pipeline with completely different configuration to what they've defined in their GitLab YAML file? I mean, that's quite technical. Do you know, Aviel?
Yes, it is possible. Basically, you create a YAML-like structure in code, and then you use that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so what we did when Aviel and I did that spike, we basically just created that, threw it in the database, and then the runner comes and picks it up. And you can just do that all day long. You can come up with all these different configurations, throw them in the database, runners come pick up the jobs. It's really cool. The weird thing about it is that when you run a pipeline, you're used to seeing the configuration defined in your YAML file. But because it's not in your YAML file, it was defined in the database, so you don't really know what it's doing. It's just running. So that's kind of the quirk to it.
Cool. So an assumption is that we're going to be reusing the same runners as the rest of their project, right?
Yes. Yep.
Cool.
And, back to kind of, are there dragons? That may be one of the problems that we run into in terms of timeouts or communication issues or things of that sort.
As a further refinement, it might be possible in the future to tag a runner with DAST, and then our jobs will only use that runner. So it can have a longer timeout and it won't have other traffic. So that's probably like a soon to come after refinement if it's the path we decide to go down.
Yeah, that's a good point, because if we're using all the existing infrastructure, we could use the tags. Then that's just a setup thing on the customer side. And then when we put it into the database, we throw that tag in there. All right, perfect. So I feel good about that one. Let's talk a little bit about the site profile configuration. So the idea here was being able to, again, create that site that you save in the database, and it has a list of values like the website, the API specification, the URL, the username, password, field, and any of the other specifics. I think we would probably add the technology in here that is associated with a website. Any other thoughts or comments on creating a site profile setting or collection?
So this involves saving it to some format, be it YAML or the database, right?
Yes, exactly.
Presumably we have to manage hiding the password.
Yes, we would.
Yep.
Don't know how that works in YAML, but I'm sure we'll find a way. Okay. And then does this also involve choosing them when you actually run your scan? Or is this just actually saving and creating?
I would say that this would just be saving and creating them. I think that there's probably another issue that I need to add for the actual configuration, or the, well, no, actually that would be included in the on-demand scans UX design. So to me, this is just about creating them and saving them.
So, right. So the way that we've got it here, this isn't built out, but basically instead of target URL here, this could be a pull down, which would say, you know, which website do you want to run this against? And then we could have another page where you set up your website with the values that are in that. So you'd set up put all these in a form, save all this, and then on this target URL, you would select that. And because if we'd have it that way, we would get rid of, you know, the specification, target availability, API host override, and potentially request headers.
By the way, from a what's easiest point of view, it's going to be easiest if we just use these profiles to trigger DAST, setting up environment variables from all these options, as opposed to changing DAST to call an API.
I'm not sure I follow.
So, so you showed us a diagram earlier where, you know, in the YAML file, they, what did they do? So they defined a profile name.
Yep.
Then the profile name was passed to DAST, and then DAST called an API. Yeah, this guy.
Yep.
Which went and got the profile, right?
Yes.
All the profile details.
Yep.
What I'm suggesting, it's probably easier if when GitLab triggers the DAST analyzer, we set up environment variables that come from their profile.
Yes. So, so instead of like this going into the analyzer, you're saying all the environment variables get set. You have this right here, and then it reads from the database and then sends all the environment variables into analyzer.
Yeah. So maybe there's some complex code we need, or maybe our template gets way more complicated. But that means we don't need to deal with the security issue of how does DAST authenticate with the API.
Right. So, yeah, absolutely. If we could do that, I think that makes sense. The reason I did not design it that way in this, and this is probably a good research spike, is this process right here is outside of Secure's realm, right? So the way that these environment variables get passed over to the runner is built into GitLab runner and built into the GitLab CI tool. So if we want to have something that parses this, to do it with the GitLab way, you'd have to open up some kind of Docker image and then pass it over to like another, and it'd be Docker and Docker or something. There's no way to read this file here on GitLab and then pass that over to the analyzer unless we get into that part of the code base. And so this structure was sidestepping that part of the code base, sends it over to DAST analyzer, and then we can build our own API endpoint on GitLab that's a secure, you know, whatever we call it, get secure settings, take the CI runner job ID, which is getting passed in as part of the GitLab runner, and then get that back here. Because the analyzer in Docker today gets the, you know, registry token and username and all those variables that get sent down to the job. So my thought is some of those variables that get sent down to the job, we would be able to use to authenticate back into the API. As opposed to trying to figure out how to parse this and then mess with that part of the CI code base.
Okay. Okay. I mean, maybe that's better.
And then the other idea here was when you're pulling this from the database, our analyzer should stay the same, like all the stuff that we're doing today and the way that we're using the environment variables. And then there's just some service that goes, gets the profile and then loads it into environment variables and then calls the analyzer the way it's getting called today. So that we leverage all the existing stuff. You could still continue to use our documented way of calling the analyzer. This just simplifies it and gets a token, then loads it into the environment variables. And again, this is just an idea. Like I'm not prescribing this as the way to do it. It's just one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, let's see what happens.
Are any of these environment variables, this is just about the ones that we already have, right? This is not about adding anything new to DAST.
Yeah, I would generally say yes. Yep. So it's all the ones that we have. There may be one or two here and there that we're gonna find out about and say, hey, this would be really cool. But generally, it's all the ones that we're using today.
Well, there are a few stories or a few issues that are adding environment variables for some common configuration things that I think that they're all in 13.0, 13.1. So there are a few new ones in terms of environment variables that we don't currently have, but most of them I think are pretty well documented and are things that people use already.
Okay, cool. Are we going to try and put the shirt sizes on these now as we go through them or later?
I'll probably come back and do that. Yeah, because what I want to do is just get the discussion going here, as opposed to like focus too much on the t-shirt size. I can come back and put t-shirt sizes in there. The main thing is just eliciting the questions that we have and getting a general understanding from everyone, like, hey, does this make sense? Okay, so that's the site profile configuration. Any other questions in terms of thoughts on complexity or sizing or definition? All right. All right, we'll go to the scan profile configuration here. So same idea, except instead of the site, it's the scan profile settings. And
I did have a couple of questions, a couple of things that I guess maybe I don't understand exactly where they would fit, whether they should be under the site or scan profiles. Like the exclude rules, I have them on the site profiles, but they probably fit better on the scan profiles. So if you guys see anything here that you think, oh, that should be on the other profile, just let me know.
yeah, so my thinking on that is there are definitely some things that are tightly coupled, right? Like you may have a website where you don't want to run a particular rule. And so we have to draw the line somewhere. And so my thought is that, again, the things that are just a website, you keep in there, and then the settings for the scanner you keep separately. Now, it's possible because they're tightly coupled, what you may end up doing is having my website, and then you may have a scan setting called my scan settings for my website, which would exclude particular rules and things of that sort. And that's the way that I would address that type of concern where like, hey, you want to disable this rule for a particular website, but for all the other scans, you don't. So you would just create, a general scan category or a quick scan, full scan, and then scan from my website. And then that would just be configured for that one instance. Because otherwise you end up shifting all of the scan settings into the site settings, and then you're kind of back to square one.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the other thing too, I would say is any of your scan settings, you could theoretically take those and run them on any website, right? So there's nothing in there that's like, so that's why you wouldn't have a username and password or an exclude URL, because those wouldn't make sense on any website. So those theoretically can run independently on any website.
And that's sort of how I was thinking about them when I was dividing them up in general. But that's why like the Ajax spider is here and not on the site profile, even though it may seem like it should be on the site profile. It's more general than a specific site, and you may have a single site that's defined that has both an JavaScript, like a single page architecture, as well as a static site component that you may want to do two different types of scans, but apply them to the same base website. So that's why like the Ajax spider is here, but I'm open to suggestions. And I do have let me see if it's shared here. I believe you guys should be able to get to this. I'm sending it in the if I can get my Zoom windows out of the way. I'm sending it in the Zoom chat. But it's a spreadsheet that Camellia started, and I started to document the actual UI. So if you go to the scan profile UI options,
Right here.
all the way over on the right, that sheet. All right, I started to document exactly what the option was in the UI, what the default was, because these are things that she wouldn't have any clue. And then the ones in red there, I don't actually know what that Zap generate config actually does. So I need to get some insight into that. But
I was just going to say, actually, some of this. So if we decide to go, well, at some point we need to go down a route, I presume, which allows users to configure which rules they will and won't run. So Zap has policies for that, I believe. But the Python scripts have a config file, which is slightly different. It's basically just a text file, like space delimited, where you basically define the ID and then the name of the vulnerability and what you want to do with it, ignore, warn, or whatever. I actually think if we're going to go down the scan policy route, because eventually we're not going to use the Python scripts anyway, I suspect we should just not put any of these config stuff in the UI. Like we should give people options for how to exclude rules and how to include rules, but internally we'll just use a policy for that.
okay, so all of those config variables that are they're in one of the issues, but all the config URL, config file, and generate config, you would suggest not adding those?
Yeah, as long as we have a way of excluding rules from actually running, because yesterday I was investigating the exclude rules that we have right now, the variable, and the rule still runs and we just always make sure it's a false positive. So for someone trying to make the scan run faster, it's not very useful. We actually need a way of turning them off as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, so you're saying not to have a way to turn those on and off in the web interface, and that instead we would ask the user to give us a text file for it?
No, I'm saying like in the web UI, do whatever makes sense for the user, whether that's a file or whether that's, here's a bunch of rules here's all of our rules and pick the ones you do or don't want.
Yep.
I'm just saying under the covers, we would probably use a scan policy for that when talking to Zap. And a scan policy and a scan config file, which is what this generate config and use the config and the config URL are for, I believe they're solving the same problem.
Okay. So we would take the rule settings and then convert that over to the scan policy file?
Correct. And then, in your UI, like in this issue we're talking about, where we're offering all these options to the user, I wouldn't offer generate config, use config file, or use config URL.
Got it. Okay.
That makes sense. I'll remove those, and we can also, I don't remember which issue those are in, but I got those from one of the new issues where we're adding some environment variables.
And Derek, it might be worth just putting that kind of in a parking lot, because we may want to have like an MVC version where like, hey, the user could pass in that file and then we deprecate that and then give them the web interface where they can configure it. So
Okay.
until we support it natively, we may want to have an ability for them to pass that in. And maybe that's, maybe it's just like, hey, give us the variable and it's just a big text field that they can paste in their data. And then we parse that through. And then we say, okay, we're no longer going to support that. We've got a clean, nice way to do it in the web interface.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The other thing that I think we should think about here is, how to trigger their stuff through an API. Because for the most part, if we're doing stuff exclusively in the web interface, we need to make sure that people don't have to log in with the browser and do it in the web interface. They should be able to do it programmatically.
Yes.
If we're pulling things out of the pipeline, we don't want to just have like, oh no, you have to do it in our website. So we'll want to make sure that we have all endpoints for all this.
Yep, I agree with that.
Is that something we're going to want to do right away, or can we do that later? That's probably, some GraphQL mutations or something of that sort.
Yeah, my guess is we'll probably want to do that when we roll this out.
Okay, so that'll be at least another issue.
Yep. So instead of like having an internal endpoint and then exposing it, we may want to use the same endpoint. But again, that's something I think we'll want to do some research on and figure out like, hey, does that add a lot more work? What's the implication of that?
Okay. And yeah, I wasn't thinking we'll be using GraphQL for this anyway, so we get the API for free. Yay.
Yep. So Derek, you have a note about those config values?
Yeah, I removed them from the this document so that Camellia doesn't get confused,
Okay.
and then we can figure out what we're going to do exactly. I like the idea. I prefer the idea of exposing all the policies to the user and creating it that way. But I think that's further down the road than what we're talking about right now.
Yep. Okay, perfect. So we got through those three issues.
I have a last question.
Yeah.
How likely are we to add variables or remove variables from this list in the future? In the next, I mean, it's impossible to say the next 2 years, but I'm asking because how we store this data will probably depend partially on how likely it is to change.
I think that it's likely that we will add variables. I don't think it's likely that we will remove variables, because I don't like, once we introduce functionality, I don't like removing it from the user. But just thinking ahead to like the policies, and I think that there will be other things that we find that are going to be useful. So I think that it's likely that we will add them.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think there may be some additional variables that we add, and then a lot of the functionality I think is going to come in some of these like config files, right? So being able to configure all your rule sets. I think Zap right now there's like 3 values you can say, like, do you want, the release alpha version? What's the threshold? And then there's like another status, and then you can do that for each rule set. So that's likely going to be like one big text file or XML or CSV or JSON or whatever. So we'll probably have a web interface for that, but I wouldn't really consider that like each one that we're going to have like a new variable, because it's a data set that once we design the interface, whether it's one variable or 1,000, it'll support all of them.
I sort of get that, but I'll catch up.
Any other questions on these three issues? Scan, site, or the asynchronous MVC? Cool. Let's talk about this in terms of, does this make sense? Are there questions that people have on how this might work or concerns?
Are you talking about the YAML issue specifically?
So either the database or the YAML file.
Are we planning to do both, or are we going to definitively make a decision to go at first, at least, for just one?
So this is my personal preference, is that we would go down the route of using the database. One of the I think big questions out there that I have, and I think for the rest of the product team, is making sure that this is consistent across the different parts of Secure. Because if you configure DAST one way and you configure the SaaS another way, there has to be a really good justifiable reason on why it's configured one way or the other. We don't want to have SaaS configured this way and DAST configured this way, and really it's kind of an arbitrary difference. So we've outlined both these as kind of a discussion point so that the other teams can look at this and say, hey, this makes sense for everyone, or if each team wants to go a different way, we have to make sure that there's a good reason for it.
The only reason I think YAML files might be preferable is in the situation where you want someone to approve and merge the change.
Yep.
But I mean, if it's just a one-off scan, maybe that doesn't matter.
Well, the other thing is more of a long-term thing, and with the database, at some point in the future, these profiles might move up to the group level, like I said before, and there is no repo there, right? So I don't want to get stuck in a place, because this is something that the other groups are already dealing with, where they're trying to move configuration up to the group level so that they can have it locked down to like a specific user role that can edit it and then push that out to all of the projects. I don't want to get locked into a place where we are saying, well, now we don't know how to do this because we implemented everything in the repo. But I agree with you, Cam. It is preferable to some people to be able to approve that kind of thing, but you can solve it the same way if we have user roles, which obviously is more work. But if you have specific users that are able to approve changes to DAST, you could theoretically do it all in the database and still have the same approval workflow. But it would be adding in a completely new area in GitLab that doesn't exist.
I have a,
Yeah. Sorry.
And Derek, I think the product question, and maybe kind of pushing back, is like, why do you need to approve this change, right? You could, like, anyone can theoretically run one of these scans from their desktop onto a website. So you shouldn't need to approve it because you're worried that someone's going to run the scan, because anyone can run these scans, whether they're using GitLab or just their desktop. So you would need to approve it if you're saying, okay, my security policy is every website needs to run A, B, and C.
Right.
And someone says, no, I'm going to go change that. Now, if that's what you're worried about, the database is a nicer way to go, because then we can actually enforce policies and query the policies much easier. If you're worried about like people changing rules and your merge request repo is your way of managing that, that then limits or makes it much more difficult for GitLab as a tool to say, hey, is every project running this scan, and is every scan set up this way?
Right. Well, and the other issue with that, and you just reminded me of that, is that a lot of these teams that are doing these scans, the people that are responsible for making the changes are in the security team, not in engineering or even product. So you would end up, if you had it only in the YAML file, or if that was your way of approving it, then you would end up with only your security people being able to approve merge requests, because if you had it to where everybody that was a maintainer could change things, and you didn't want a developer to go in and change a scan setting, it would be very easy for them to do that and slip by the security team if all of your approvals were just in the merge request, because that's the entire repo is maintained by the engineering team anyway.
I mean, it seems like there's, you know, limitations or positives on both. My suggestion is that we would just involve other people, like someone like Philippe, in these decisions.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely an idea that has to get circulated.
Yeah. Is there any issues with offline scans accessing a GitLab API? Presumably, if the runner can access GitLab API, so can DAST, right?
When you say offline, you're talking like what we've done for air-gapped and all that?
Sorry, air-gapped, yeah.
Not that I know of, because your runner is offline, or sorry, your runner is in the network where GitLab is. And if your runner can get the job, your runner's talking to GitLab. So your runner should be able to go back and forth to, in fact, your runner has to, because it has to be able to send status updates to GitLab and so on and so forth. The only limitation is, of course, where your website is.
And our analyzers are set up as if they're hidden from a network point of view behind the runner, like a NAT network. I mean, I don't know enough about this stuff. It's just, I think we should ask someone who knows more about it than me. I presume it's fine. But
Yeah, I don't know of any issue, but that's not to say there isn't one. Aviel, I think you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I have a question about the concept of putting things at the group level, or about who our end users are. In the messaging around our secure features, I've seen repeatedly that one of GitLab's advantages is that we focus on enabling developers, engineers, to be the ones to find and fix vulnerabilities. How does that work with the features that we're going to be creating? A lot of this seems to be making it easier for devs to be doing this, which is great. But the idea of moving things to a group level, or building things specifically for like a kind of security department, enterprisey thing, seems a bit contrary. So where do we fit?
Right. And I think that there's two different levels on that, because that is the goal, is to make it to where developers, I mean, it's the whole shift left idea, right? So that is the goal. But when you're talking specifically about enterprises, which is another one of the big pushes for GitLab, is enterprise readiness, while they may allow the engineering group to do the testing and to look at the results and fix those results, a lot of times they don't allow the engineering group to own the configurations, because it's very easy for an engineer, and I'm guessing that in these enterprises, they don't trust their engineers, because they could easily change the configuration, just run a passive scan, say, hey, I didn't find any issues, and pass that on and say, hey, look, my code is fine. And then change the configuration back to the active scan. If you don't really have any type of way to block that, then you can get into a lot of trouble, especially if you're in an industry that has a lot of regulation, like finance or healthcare. A lot of that has to be controlled directly by a security manager. A lot of times the security analysts that I'm talking to don't even have access to change those configurations. So the goal is to get them testing, the developers, but you also have to think about who the layer above them in terms of what the regulations are in a specific organization.
Okay, that makes sense. So especially with configuration stuff, permissions might be more restricted.
Right.
Are we gonna have to care a lot about having easy to access sort of like logs of the scans that get run in their configuration?
My thought was if we log every change that's done in the configuration area to, what is it, the activity monitor area of GitLab, and I don't know anything about that area or what all is required to have something there, but if we can throw any changes, so Seth, if you could go to GitLab quickly and go to the activity area. Yeah, my thought is if we can have like a security events or something like that as a tab up there, then we can log all the changes to the configuration there and have a historical record that should satisfy any terms of anything in terms of audits or compliance or anything like that.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense.
The other piece, and we probably won't have time to get to this today, is in the JSON report, we have a scan values. And one of the ideas too is that in the scan details in that JSON report, we would have a list of what the configurations are. And at some point in our dashboard or on our vulnerability page, when you click on a vulnerability, you should be able to see, okay, this vulnerability was found on this scan on this date. And then potentially click on that scan and see what were the configuration values for that scan. So you could say, okay, this was found on this day and this time by scan, by scan using ZAP version whatever or DAST version whatever, and here's the configuration settings, so that you've got full traceability and repeatability. And that's much further down the road. But the idea is that, anytime you find a vulnerability, like you want to have full traceability as to how it was found, and then also like some scripts to be able to reproduce it.
Cool. So that plays into the replay epic.
Yep, exactly. And I think, I could be mistaken, but on the activity log, if you change any of the stuff under settings in the admin, I believe a lot of that shows up here in some of these audit logs. Any other questions or thoughts on this? Any thoughts in terms of the difference in complexity, whether the database versus the YAML tends to be more complicated or more work?
Only that I wonder if we can reuse more components with the YAML stuff. So like in terms of analyzing differences between and getting someone to approve it, if that's something we need to do, you can do that with a merge request.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think for this top one, we have to answer the workflow question, right? Is there a workflow? Is there approvals? My understanding from most of GitLab, like in the admin settings and all that, if you have access to it, you can do it. But that also requires a high level of access. In most cases, it's a maintainer and owner. And so figuring out how we manage this, whether that's a maintainer or an owner, GitLab doesn't have a lot of different permission levels, so it gets a little challenging there.
One disadvantage of the top one actually is that you can't, if your build fails, so if your scan fails or errors, you can't reproduce it locally because now you can't download all the content that can reproduce the issue.
Right.
Not that if one of our users had a scan profile.yaml, we wouldn't be able to access the YAML file anyway.
But yeah, that is a good point of just making sure we've got good debugging, a good way to debug this.
That could be an argument for keeping in both concepts, like Seth was talking about having a fallback, so that maybe if you do have that type of debugging, you do give them a write out of what that profile would be in YAML so that they could reproduce it locally.
Yeah, maybe that's enough.
Yeah, and that could get into kind of the technical implementation. Again, like we have a little agent that goes and gets this file, writes it out to a YAML file on the analyzer, and then that gets parsed into environment variables so that if there's a problem, you could actually go and grab that YAML file or something.
That might be nice, because if we save a file in the repo, we'll probably have to make an MR, which might not be too complicated, but it's an extra level of complexity, because otherwise we're making it commit directly to master, which I don't know, not normally a practice we do.
Yeah, and the challenge always with the MRs, right, is if the file already exists and you need to add text to that file, how do you add that text, right? You have to parse the original file, figure out what you want to add, and then figure out where it goes, because when we create an MR, we shouldn't create merge conflicts. So we have to be really smart about where that text goes. So that's one of the challenges going down this path. And I think some of the earlier designs, they had some magic things where it's just like create MR, and it's like, that's actually a lot of work. All right. I don't know if we need to jump into the file system or the database, because those are basically the same thing from that overview document. On-demand DAST scans post MVC. Let's see if I can pull that up here. Derek, is there more in here that we haven't really discussed? I think this is kind of the culmination of all the stuff that we've talked about here.
Right.
I don't know if schedules is something that we should talk about now.
Probably not. No, because I don't have anything written up around that, and I don't even know if that's something that we plan, or obviously it's something I'd like to get done by the end of the year, but I don't know if it's something we can plan on having in the complete definition right now.
Okay. So then for kind of to wrap this up, we're talking about the configuration, the site settings, which we talked about, the scan settings, and then the branch. And we've talked about all those different pieces. Sweet.
Yep.
All right. I don't have these linked. Configuration UI. Is that not an Epic? Do you have issues for configuration UI? Derek, do you know what Epic these are under?
Yeah, I think that it's probably linked in the to complete Epic. I think it's possible that I just forgot to add the label correctly.
Viable to complete. Okay, well, we will go on to the DAST configuration ones. We've talked about the Zap Python scripts previously. Oh, it looks like some of these are duplicated. The Wappleizer. Derek, you want to talk a little bit about what Wappleizer would be and and kind of how you envision using that?
Yeah, I mean, this is based pretty much mainly on what Cam found about this add-on. I think that it would be cool and a good use of Zap to be able to scan and automatically configure those technology variables so that they wouldn't have to go through and check every single one that they use, and maybe they forgot one. But yeah, I think that doing this programmatically in a scan would be a lot easier. The question that I have right now is, can it be in, does it have to run before the scan as a way of building up the configuration? Can it be run in line? So you start a scan, it runs Wappalizer, then passes that config over. Those are the questions that I don't know the answers to, which is why starting off, I just want to see how it would be used and whether it would actually solve any problems for us. But yeah, the auto configuration, I think, would be a huge plus for us. It's something that I haven't seen many other DAST tools do.
Cool. So for 13.1, it sounds like let's just go play around with this, see what it does, write something up so that we're all on the same page as to what it does. And then the potential applications for where this would get implemented is if we go back to what we talked about before, the site settings. Potentially,
Yes.
instead of using that checkbox of like, hey, does it have, MySQL? Does it have, Postgres? Does it have, MS SQL, blah, 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 JavaScript, et cetera, et cetera. That could be, we could theoretically not even have that checkbox list, and we just say auto discover. Maybe it's a radio button that says auto discover or the checkbox list. And if it's auto discover, we could use Wappalizer here. It goes, figures that out, and then based on that, it could use the correct rules or whatever.
Yeah, theoretically.
Okay. Cool. Sounds like a lot of magic. Any questions on this or? Okay. I don't think we need to go through these. DAST should get the URL from an environment to scan from a .env. Aviel, can you just give a quick overview as to what this is? I think it's a pretty straightforward item. Yeah.
Okay.
Or did you put this together or Cam did?
Cam did.
Oh, Cam. I saw maybe your name in the sheet.
Essentially, Nicole, I think it was, suggested this might be a good use for DAST. So I created an issue for it. Basically, we use an environment url.txt when we deploy review apps to get the review app URL. In theory, we could use a .env file. I don't know if it provides much value. It's probably a new way of doing things, but beyond that.
And do you know, is .env, is that a industry thing or is that a GitLab?
I don't know.
Okay. Cool. Any questions on this one? All right. We've got, I think, 2-3 minutes left. So we'll resume later this week and kind of get through some of the other items that we haven't talked about. So I guess we can stop there for now. Just quick kind of reflection if this is helpful for everyone, if there's different ways that we should go through this for our next session.
I will say that I think that a lot of the rest of the issues are probably going to go a lot faster because most of them were created by the team rather than me. So it's really the first few that were the main big, huge changes, and a lot of these are more implementation type issues.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly useful to be on the same page as well. So I think this session is good, even if you go in the end and just put a medium on everything, I still think it's useful. But the only question I have is, so I know we're going through a stage essentially of, defining decks for all the identified work we've done. I think like we're still in a stage where we're learning so much about Zap in particular that we're finding a lot of new work. So the only outstanding thing I don't know is how we capture that in our DAST to complete. Like, do we just leave space, or do we just not do it? Or
So I think there's maybe two parts of that. There's work that we will find in order to support some of these features, and the deck scoring is designed to accommodate that, right? So if we have a large here, large and large, the back endpoints is 34, which anticipates that there's a lot of stuff there that we're going to find things. The point of this would be that we are trying as this issue to do this particular item, right? A scan profile. So I think that's part of your question. And maybe perhaps the other part of your question is like, there may just be some cool things that we find in Zap that we're like, hey, that'd be really cool. And let's go and add, some new widget or whatever. The deck scoring does not address that because that's just new functionality that we learn about, or maybe find some new open source tool or whatever. That likely would not get incorporated into DAST to complete, or if it did, it would probably we'd have to swap something out for it, or reprioritize, or whatever the case may be. So the most that we can
do, the work would still get played if it was important enough.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, this is going to accommodate like, hey, yeah, we don't really know how to implement this, and that's kind of agile, and we'll figure it out and tweak these stories as we get closer to these issues. And then new features, like certainly if you find stuff in Zap or other tools, open up issues. And if it doesn't go in to complete, it might be something that goes into the lovable.
Right. And my goal is, I'm hoping to think through and have you all help me think through some of these so that we don't have too much scope creep in terms of new features. Obviously the implementation details are going to be needed to be figured out, but I'm going to be actively trying not to add new features outside of what we have here, unless it's just something that everybody agrees this is incredibly important for us to add.
Perfect. Any other feedback on today's session, or anything we should do differently for later this week?